You are listening to an Unlocked New Models episode.
Less than half of our interviews, discussions, audio dramas, or monologues are ever made public.
To access all of our content or to join the discussions in our Discord server, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com.
You're now listening to New Models.
Welcome to New Models. I'm Patrick McGraw, the editor and publisher of Heavy Traffic, a fiction magazine based out of New York. What you're about to hear is a reading of Machine Time, a long-form essay that was written by the artist Seth Price for Heavy Traffic Issue 1, which we published in 2022. This will be the first in a multiple-part reading of the piece that's being done as part of the Heavy Traffic residency with New Models. Stay tuned for the rest of this piece, as well as readings of other pieces from Heavy Traffic. You can also go to heavytrafficmagazine.com for further details about the magazine, including details of our upcoming issue, Heavy Traffic 4.
The historian is in danger of forgetting that his subjects spent much of their time asleep, and that when asleep, they had dreams. Peter Brown, The World of Late Antiquity. I remember moments when I was listening to music and the sudden shift from one chord to the next stirred up feelings I couldn't name or understand. These feelings arose not from one chord or the other, but from the transition itself, a fleeting synthesis, and as the music unfolded, they lingered like clouds of silt kicked up underwater. When I was a teenager, I thought of these unsettled feelings as adult, partly because they were triggered by the sophisticated chords of classical or jazz, but mostly because I didn't understand them. Young people often mark things that are hard to understand as signposts to further degrees of refinement, thinking, this will make sense when I'm older. Later in life, however, I learned that some things are simply not to be understood. I came to realize that these moments of emotional revelation had nothing to do with any musical transition. Rather, they arose from what I, myself, was going through. In those decades, we were all living through a chord change. This was not a quick transition. Generations unspooled entirely within the lingering clouds of silt. The old world, based on 500 years of empire, was yielding to something obscure and unknowable. Understanding this larger shift was not yet possible, of course, because a transition can only be grasped retrospectively. The task of understanding will fall to the people who come after us, the shamans and poets and singers, the ones who are simultaneously drunk and sober, the ones who choose to live at the edge of the settlement where they can look from the light to the darkness and back. I remember a time when I made a journey away from my life as a New York artist and into the unknown. In a speedboat hunched over to shield my tote from sea spray, I understood that the journey so far had been a slow detaching from modern life. The progression from New York cab to jumbo jet to prop plane to car to boat felt like a journey not across space but back through time. Exiting the tiny terminal had delivered me into the disinterested calm of a world in low gear, a world of thick darkness, tree frogs, and the click of a distant lighter. The island air was close and heavy, like breath coming across a pillow. The touts in the car park couldn't be bothered to leave their front seats, preferring to sit with the doors open, a foot on the curb, thumbing their phones and smoking. I was oceans away from all the people back home who were presumably still fighting their way through wind tunnels of numbers, and my world continued to shrink, from the stasis of the car park to the inside of a beat-up taxi, as we traversed the island through disordered blackness, with something quiet playing on the radio. But why had I come here? I knew that I had done enough Ashtanga in my life, and enough ayahuasca, and enough Qigong of the 14 brocades form. I had written plenty of poems, and made poetry by other means, and cast spells that summoned clouds of impurity and fragmentation. I had cooked meals according to vegan no-oil principles so strict that avocados and nuts were prohibited. I had built myself primitivist twig furniture in the manner of Gusto Gracer. I had designed business envelopes that could be slipped into and worn to a party. I had fasted a week in silent isolation, pondering over whether a person walking while wearing a single shoe would feel their left or right footfall to be more correct. I knew that my natural progression was from silicon to carbon, and I knew I was emerging from the crystalline way and stepping into an organic way. I knew my ultimate ends were contemplation and surrender. I understood that anything could be anything, because there was but one material in the universe, everything. I also knew that we were in the middle of a drastic chord change. I knew that most people lacked ears to hear the new music, eyes to read the new writing, and senses to feel the new people. If a person was lucky enough to have the right ears, eyes, and senses as I was, they could expect only discomfort, because an encounter with new art, science, or ideas was marked by groundlessness in the face of chaos. This was especially true as you approached middle age, a time when more and more of the objects lying around seemed to lack names. Heft an object, and it bristled with unseen forces and obscure intent. To reckon with it, you'd have to maintain your grip through waves of darkness and coldness, all because you sought gnosis and transformation. Art, however, was always a negotiation with the shift. Art was about change, whether it was a painting that affected your mood for 4 minutes, or a body of work that changed the outlook of a generation. Octavio Paz wrote that the vision of chaos is a sort of ritual bath, a regeneration through immersion in the original fountain, a return to the life before. And I was on this journey because I was chasing that chaos and groundlessness and not knowing. I could sense the new world coming, and I wished to visit the party at the end of time in order to say farewell to the old ways, the old art, the old people. At the far end of the island, the taxi came to a halt, and I stepped onto a beach that was washed by wavelets I could hear but couldn't see. There was no moon and no artificial light, only the orange glow of the waiting boat captain's cigarette. The beams of our headlights disappeared somewhere over the water, and beyond them I could infer the next island only from a hulking blackness, an absence of stars above the shoreline lights. The thing I sought lay somewhere on that island, within the trader's compound. I checked my watch. It would be December 20th for a few more hours. Soon I'd be rousing the non-committal staff at the hotel and getting some sleep, before waking to do a bit of reconnaissance, and tomorrow night I would infiltrate the trader's winter solstice party. I had witnessed the trader once before, in a New York hotel lobby where I'd camped for the opportunity. His family had crossed the room in advance of their wheeled luggage, like 4 new coins rolling across the carpet. He was tanned with a graying mane and wore khakis, trainers, and a billowing linen Oxford. His stride was measured, but his face drew my attention with its aggressive focus. His mother might be an Argentine Jew who'd married a Swiss banker, but then again, he could be ethnically Lebanese or Turkish or anything at all. In fact, I thought he could have been a relative of mine. My own Greek and British roots certainly gave me an ambiguous ethnicity. Jewish, European, Italian. In his case, the ambiguity really came down to wealth. For the globe-trotting classes had a talent for obscuring their origins under layers of refinement, painting themselves with taste and wellness, and thereby hiding ethnicity and tradition. Poverty, too, could erase these things, of course. It was only the middle classes who were unable to hide their fundamental differences, which was why they were most anxious about the coming human similarity of universally middling heights, darker hair, coffee-colored skin, muted garments, bared teeth. A step behind the trader came 2 teen boys with high-tech outerwear and lavish curls, radiating useless vitality. Their dumb faces were, in the most masculine way, honest. Bringing up the rear was Ilsa, a petite lady with a honeycomb of hair and a grin like a bit lodged between her teeth. Husband and wife sniped in French as they walked, then switched to English at the desk. Every member of the family was fluent in 3 languages and charming in each. The trader leaned in to make the arrangements, while his sons joshed each other. Ilsa swiveled my way, brandishing her phone, and I looked elsewhere. A resin-topped coffee table had been bolted to the ceiling upside down, and a coil of string bulbs placed on top glowed through the layers of plastic. A spindly, very black man in an ochre windowpane suit was loitering just inside the entrance, speaking into his phone in a language of clicks and pops. He had a name tag, a phone holster, and a Purell holster, and his monologue had not eased up the entire time I'd been here. Second-wave indie rock from the aughts played at a subdued level. As the family bobbed and weaved against this bland backdrop, I realized that families were essentially gangs, possessed of simmering internal rivalries, to be sure, but ultimately bound by a circle-the-wagons mentality necessary to protect a fragile shared worldview. And what was this family's worldview? The trader had gone to great lengths to shelter everything from meddlesome regulation. He had supposedly made a fortune in the 90s organizing tours of the Holy Land for right-wing evangelicals prepping for apocalypse. After a few years spent moving the family around for obscure reasons, he suddenly purchased land on this quiet West Indian island, a formerly British colony with high literacy rates and no interest in its landholders' finances. Sooner or later, the trader told a magazine at the time, we all have to step aside to make way for young talent. So, here they lived, year-round, in a modernist fortress. The boy's tutor and his girlfriend came from Bern for 10 months of the year and stayed in the guest house. The maids were also from Switzerland, but were Kosovar and had trained as hair curators. From email skims, I was aware of a rumor among the wealthy expats that the trader and Ilsa were intelligence agents. Supposedly, the second floor housed a vast array of computers, and the roof hosted an array of satellite dishes, too plentiful for family use. A pack of wolfhounds roamed the grounds, an electrified fence enclosed the compound, and a serious vegetable garden supplied most of the food. I considered all of this as I headed up the darkened slope the next evening in a jeep I'd informally rented from the hotel manager. The island was a thickly forested cinder cone 1,000 meters high, almost perfectly circular at sea level. Human activity was concentrated in a necklace of settlements at the base, linked by a coastal road primarily used to get people to town on market day. The locals avoided the impassable slopes, save a few intrepid or unhappy people who had hacked freeholds out of the jungle. It was only the wealthy expats who laid claim to the upper reaches of the volcano. For them, raising hectares of undergrowth was not a problem, and it guaranteed views and isolation. The trader's villa appeared ahead, a long rectilinear structure of poured-in-place concrete designed on an open-air, tropical modern plan. The unlit second floor looked small and self-contained, hovering over the ground floor's larger footprint. As I parked the jeep, other guests were beginning to pull up. We nodded at each other as we pocketed keys and headed for the front door, where somebody was waiting with a tray of glasses. I was nervous, but I reminded myself that I was a cultured, middle-aged artist from New York City. I had plenty of armor. I remember that I was always seeking scarier picture books. My mother would consult the librarians, who recommended a few, the Taily Poe, the Giant Devil Dingo, and Baleful Beasts and Eerie Creatures, this one worth hundreds on eBay. But there weren't many books that were seriously frightening. It makes sense because you need adults who like to shock children, and publishers willing to gamble on the impulse, and open-minded adult buyers, and children who enjoy the spark of alienation. That adds up to quite a fine sieve. In the end, I was forced to invent my own stories, which proved so popular that Ms. Thompson invited me to tell stories to the other first graders in a weekly session. The tales I told were improvisations, chopped performances of modulation and grasping, a weaving of my own fears into something approximating a public language. Much later, I realized that my mature artwork was also a sort of chopped, impatient narrative of the present, told in many voices. For example, if I reach into the future, I can tell you about being a young girl. Like most 10-year-old girls, I've never been on a date. I haven't been out dancing or gone to the club. I haven't been to a concert or a Broadway production. I haven't picked someone up in a bar. I didn't go home with them. We didn't spend hours exploring each other's bodies. Our lovemaking was not savage at first, then tender. I've never walked around in a haze, 'cause I couldn't get you out of my head. I don't know anything the songs and poems talk about. I've never been obsessed with anyone but myself, and I dislike myself. To paraphrase Rick Owens, my best and worst quality is that I'm a selfish cunt. I'm untouched by sex, and more than that, incapable of love. And this is exactly why older people prize my opinions, why they'll pay top dollar. You might ask, how does that work? There's a dialogue in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts where Hermes Trismegistus advises that gnosis begins by looking within and writing about what you find there. My task is to express without end, to open the gates so that every revelation might be shared. I may have been raised in a little box marked freedom, but a box is a good place to report on the inner world for my older clients. The requests I get are usually fairly simple, things like, what were the aughts all about? You do have to be able to read weak signals, of course, and the signals seem to keep getting fainter, receding under waves of noise. But for people like us who are truly sensitive, the topography of the ocean floor is perfectly visible on the surface of the water. To us, the new people, your life is nothing but a box of costume jewelry open for plunder. Soon we'll be able to lay eyes on a person and simultaneously grasp them as they are, as they were, and as they will be. Show me a newborn, and I will know this lump as it was in the dim shape of nothingness, and as a middle-aged soul shipwrecked on a reef, and as a dying organism, the full person in 4 dimensions, a deck of cards splayed on the bays. It's all there, it's all broken, and that's the love I'm holding out for. There are a lot of us now. If you could put on a pair of special glasses and survey the crowd from a balcony like Hitler or the Pope, you'd see red dots everywhere, like an infection breaking out. It's been coming for some time. In the Neolithic period, every human could love, but by the Middle Ages many were no longer capable. This accelerated over the course of the dumb 20th century, and soon there won't be anyone left who can love. But humanity will probably turn wise and calm. There's a tremendous calm in those who don't know love and sex, because for us, the new people, all the things that most of you want, money, power, luxury, service, social status, hold no interest. It's the main reason adults are scared of children, but we don't pay any mind because we have work to do. When I do this work, I go by my other name, the true name, the random jumble of letters that constantly regenerates. Normal, functional human interactions are increasingly coming to resemble public performances, and all the old language is consequently being replaced by neologisms, nonsense, and hollow comedy. The manic flow is beginning to resemble art, where, as everyone knows, meaning is the enemy. By placing your output beyond meaning, you situate it in the realm of the non-human, like the subatomic realm of quantum phenomena, which can never be fully recuperated for the humanist project. You know what's cool too? Throw in random misspellings. Keep it weird though. Be sure to stay ahead of the kids who kind of get it, but call their housewares line something like epochal. In this context, it makes sense that a random arrangement of signs is the best personal branding. As Stuart Brand noted way back in 1985, computers suppress our animal presence. When you communicate through a computer, you communicate like an angel. And everyone knows the speech of the angels is unintelligible. I had noticed that older people often thought of art as an intensely human activity, the essence of our messy, subjective experience, the mingled breath of the we. Literature was seen as a way of building empathy for those who were different, and those literary expressions that seemed nihilistic or misanthropic were recuperated as celebrations of difference, the range of experience, and the possibility of communication from extreme states, and were thus more important to the humanist argument than works of genre fiction, which reflected mere market forces. The expression arts and humanities joined 2 unrelated terms in what was an apparently warm handshake, but we, the new people, knew otherwise. We knew that art was not human. This did not mean that art was separate from us. To the contrary, it was an important part of us. It was the non-human part. The human condition had always been a point of intersection with other forces. You just had to examine the history of art, which was full of beings in which humanness mixed with the forms of goats, birds, reptiles, and insects. These chimeras were made iconic by Hieronymus Bosch, who portrayed what Raoul Vaneigem called the conflict that goes on making and unmaking our very sense of the human, pushing humanity back to its wild beginnings. And when you pushed all the way back to the Stone Age, you found the same half-human beings, like the antler-headed sorcerer painted in the cave of the Trois Frères. The invention of photography reincarnated this ancient hybridity and placed it at the center of the world. The earliest photographs are the first record we have of the encounter between human and machine, but beyond simply documenting a gaze meeting a lens, they blend two distinct temporalities, human time and machine time. Painting's power had always come from the way it offered up the one-to-one time of a hand, moving through time and space. To regard a painting was to see a ghostly record of the workings of a body. To this, the photograph now added the processing time of the machine. A photo was both quick, in the bodily gestures of hand and eye, framing the composition and releasing the shutter, and slow, since one then had to wait for the development of the negative, the illumination and enlargement of the image, and its printing onto paper. This strange new mix of temporalities was frozen there, forever present in the plane of the image. From now on, the human would be all mixed up in an uneasy relationship with the non-human. It was a shift that must have stirred strange new emotions in viewers. These emotions, however, were 20th century emotions. A century on, electronic cameras did away with chemical processing, only to reassert machine time through software and circuitry. With the introduction of editing software, processing became the signal artistic act, the timeline its triumph over monkish human time. By the first decades of the 21st century, art found itself newly empowered to address everything as so much dead material splayed out on the table. Writing, moving images, music, gaming. An artist could raid these cultural forms without having to venture into the once independent spheres of journalism and criticism, documentary film or underground video festivals, bands or music venues, computer science. Anything that could be laid out on the mortuary table was claimed for art. It sounds great, but the arts were only the vanguard of a wave that saturated the entire communicative landscape, superficially making everyone a creator as it sucked all of life into machine time. For millennia, one had measured oneself against the cycles of the seasons and the heavens, or against changing social mores and geopolitical configurations. To now be compelled to measure one's life against the pace of machine time-invited madness. In middle school, I continued to seek alienation. Henri Michaud thought that the world is in fact heavy, thick, encumbering. To tolerate it, you have to reject much of it one way or another. I could sense this thickness and obscurity, and in my own way I was already turning my shoulder. Just before the onset of puberty, I discovered 3 artists who would become guides in this respect: J.G. Ballard, H.P. Lovecraft, and H.R. Geiger. Immediately I began signing my own stories as S.E. Price. I pored over Lovecraft's books and letters and biography, noting how he used the unnameable and obscure. When I persuaded my father to read me Lovecraft at night, he promptly fell asleep, later complaining, "Why say something transpired when you just mean it happened?" I taped a Geiger poster to my wall that depicted a diseased or decaying female life form erotically entwined with machinery. I puzzled over the yellowing Ballard paperbacks handed down by a cousin bound for college, particularly struck by a story in which a man ceases to understand anything in his environment and enters a rapture of non-comprehension that ends in murder and suicide. This may have helped prepare the ground for a teenage revelation that nothing in the world had a name. While I could see that a class of object like oak tree might be useful in corralling some generally observed tendencies, I knew that there were no actual oak trees. There was no sneaker, no building, and no Seth, only an endless and interconnected expanse of creation, possessed of limitless forms, but no identities, indifferent to our signposts, carrying on with its mysterious busywork. I had discovered that with a slight tilt of my head, all the meanings flickered and vanished, and it filled me with a vertiginous, darkly ecstatic feeling. For years I was an unhappy materialist. By denying the power of the names in favor of a mute material world, I had evidently turned my back on meaning itself. Much later I came to see the potentially mystical qualities of this position, and was gratified to discover the via negativa, the way of thinking that begins with early Christians like the shadowy 5th century figure Pseudo-Dionysius, who argued in favor of the truly mysterious darkness of unknowing and condemned human names and symbols as pictures boldly used to represent God, so that what is hidden may be brought out into the open and multiplied, what is unique and undivided may be divided up, and multiple shapes and forms be given to what has neither shape nor form. In any case, the insight would prove useful in weathering the storms of making art, which mocks its creator by turning one way to refract the sparkle of meaning, then another to reveal itself as dull and senseless. I was equipped to carry on regardless, aware that while my art might have nothing to do with me and was possibly meaningless, that was beside the point. However, other difficulties arose. If oak tree is not allowed, neither is artist, and it was an identity I resisted until well after my first gallery show. The term itself felt mortifying, like husband or wife, silly mantles that one dons only as part of a devil's bargain. My position was that I made art, and when I did so, I qualified as an artist. But that was an activity, not an identity. Others could wear the robe. I was content to carry on with my mysterious busy work. You're an artist? Well, I've done some videos, I've made some sculptures. It was only when I quit my day job in 2005 and had to write artist on my taxes that I got over myself and donned the robes in all their magical idiocy. Donna Haraway writes that there are 3 important boundaries: human to animal, organism to machine, and material to immaterial. The works of Geiger, Ballard, and Lovecraft need these boundaries, could barely exist without them, yet only to transgress them in a touchingly unguarded manner that invites parody. I was fascinated by the rampant mutations and transitions in these books and paintings. They echoed my own becoming dark and becoming cold. Mutation and transition are the red thread running through my mature artwork, evident not only in the shifts between video, sculpture, photography, writing, and painting, but within the works themselves. Vacuum-formed bodies, silhouettes of the negative space between human touch, decapitated heads printed on mylar, photographs of liquefying human skin, machine-made tubes penetrating my own paintings. The practice of divesting and reinvesting meaning might be good preparation for a life of art making, but I can report that it's dangerous for a teenager. Exploring the underground means you divert more and more energy to the parts that push blindly through the dirt. And if you aren't wise, for instance, if you're going through puberty, you shortchange all the growth that should be happening up above in the sunlight. When I revel in the knowledge that I am not only myself, Seth, but also a mere lump of nameless, undifferentiated nature that does not need or care, you know the non-human has a hand on my wrist. You can be sure that I pretend not to notice as I am pulled upward, outward, and finally apart. It was early in the evening of the longest night of the year. I roamed the trader's tropical modern house with a mason jar of rum and ginger beer. The overall architectural impression was of fearsome rationality and uptightness. Supposedly, the building had been put together by master craftsmen from Zurich because no islanders, or Americans for that matter, were capable of constructing a precise Olympic-sized pool from the shitty local concrete. Breezeways ended in portals to the Caribbean night, and all around was the insistent trilling of tree frogs. I passed standing brass censers of smoldering cardamom and basins of lemongrass oil. The floors were strewn with chamomile stalks. I gradually realized that almost every household good or object, no matter how functional and unremarkable, a shoehorn, a flask of olive oil, a thumb drive, a pencil, was a sly and rare artist's addition. The first guests were scattered here and there, checking out the villa, poised respectfully with hands behind their backs like museum goers. Against all the stark concrete, the wealthy partygoers made striking tableau. There was a Chinese entrepreneur and an ex-Mossad security consultant going on about Tora Bora, and a nerdy writer from Lagos. A middle-aged white guy wearing a fleece quarter zip and drivers was shaking his head mildly. Starbucks? You say it's a coffee shop? There was a spirited debate about which was worse, the first or second day of jet lag. I'm telling you, he's got it bad, and it's the third day. Okay, but my thing is, I don't care how wretched you are as long as you die like a holy man. My thing is, live every day like it's your birthday. My thing is, make sure you live in a house full of good places to hide. My thing is, there's no barber on earth so expensive that you don't have to go back for a touch-up. Like, really? My thing is, seeing two kids having sex might be our culture's primal scene. My thing is, I'm finishing up first-round financing for a new soccer league. So far, we got Eritrea, Palestine, Northern Ireland, Quebec, Kurdistan, Tibet, East Timor, Corsica. Oh, that's smart. There'll be a lot more for sure. Very smart. Well, what can I say? I'm a Carrie and a Slytherin. No, you're more of a Samantha and a Hufflepuff, I feel. How dare you? My identity is very personal to me. I left before the fight turned ugly and paused a bit further down the hall to grab a handful of snacks from a platter of lichen, ticks, and algae. An amused older white guy like myself was lurking by the kitchen wrapped up in rags and capes and hats, wearing beat-up espadrilles with no socks and a floor-grazing scarf. We know him by sight. He's the dark hipster, the evil hipster, the drugs all gone, the electroclash dream shriveled. He was supposedly that one lucky guy who got in on that secret auction staged after Apple headquarters closed, full of vintage sterling candlesticks entombed in decades of wax, chipped signage and basque, spindly faux bois lawn furniture, chunky amateur loose-sight sculptures from the 60s, mismatched pre-war cufflinks with inlaid lapis lazuli, and all lots branded with the Apple logo for resale on the open market at inflated prices. But after he made off like a bandit, he plunged too deep into the mirror. As I moved on, I reflected that an empire in decline begins to gather its disparate artifacts into one jumble, recklessly mixing inside and outside. A Roman aristocrat in 360 CE would garb himself in the raiment of the barbarians, garments that had once been beneath regard, Saxon trousers, a woolen shirt woven in the Danube, a cloak from northern Gaul. I smiled, nodding with recognition. Just that afternoon, I'd been tooling around the island in supreme sweats, pumping Bladee. I stepped through a doorway onto a balcony that jutted into the night and rested my drink on the balustrade. On this side of the property, the volcano dropped away steeply, and I saw that I was perched 60 feet in the air. Far below, the compound's electrified fence tacked inward and nearly touched the steel stanchions supporting the line of cantilevered balconies. Beyond the fence, a bizarre parallel party had assembled on the descending slopes. Groups of islanders were milling around a series of open fires which they fed with bits of plastic and rubber. Directly below me, a knot of people were dancing energetically, or so I thought, until a noise drew my attention to the next balcony, where a group of guests were taking turns dropping scraps of food, inciting furious battle. My gaze wandered a bit farther down the hill. A teen couple whom I guessed were brother and sister were engaged in sexual acts, while a circle of middle-aged people watched and lazily masturbated, and small children rifled through the couple's clothing. Further away was an older woman who seemed to be stretching lewdly. I realized that her lower legs had been burned away, and she was using the charred stumps to draw symbols in the sand under a hooded man's direction. Far below, at the edge of the jungle, I could make out what might have been pyres of burning human forms and people trundling laden wheelbarrows into the trees. I returned to the party and spent a moment with a bald, racially ambiguous giant in what looked like a toddler's onesie, which upon inspection was made of fine linen corduroy paired with sarkaline Moroccan babooshes, a portrait of a man sleepwalking through a drizzle of dividends. The giant had a halting, reedy voice, and he stooped slightly to make himself heard as he discussed a recent Chief Keef concert he'd been to, which recalled a Ja Rule show he'd seen in Chicago in the early aughts. Without yielding space for comment, he offered the nugget that rap music was a brilliant way of dealing with historical material, a tool for synthesizing events and writing history, an oral tradition that emerged from technology, all tied to the absolute contemporaneity of slang, race, and current experience, and this made it crucial for a community that had always been denied historical continuity. And then there was the poetry of disjunction, fragmentation, etc. But what was happening now, the giant wondered, nodding slightly at his cocktail. What was happening now? I said something about a Zen attitude. This inspired the giant to tell another soft-voiced story that could potentially crackle on the page. Apparently the early morning prep guys in the falafel joint under the Ashtanga studio were disturbing everyone's practice with extremely loud music, causing all manner of bad vibes. People who spent 10 hours a week cultivating goodwill were seething with class and race-based resentment. So the giant looked into it and discovered that the prep staff was cranking the restaurant's front-of-the-house system because it was the only way they could hear anything way back in the kitchen. And he bought them a boom box. Problem solved. I wondered about the guests at this remote stronghold. What was their connection to one another or to anything at all? I wouldn't have been surprised to learn that the soft-spoken giant was born and raised in the West Indies on these very slopes to impoverished local people, i.e., that he was a black man, but money had synthesized and rewired all that difference. Take nothing for granted, I concluded, not this far out, in the most distant reach, at the edge of the map of money. On the one hand, it was absurd to contemplate a billionaire in a onesie gifting a radio to a group of Ecuadorian kitchen staff with a namaste dip and a Hamza hand. On the other hand, the story was actually impressive. He had solved the problem in an easy, selfless way that hadn't required threats or raised voices. We were definitely going to need a smaller map. The trader's family had done a good job of departing from the social, I thought, or at least had oriented themselves so that all contact with the outer world was entirely on their own terms. I knew, of course, that the rich were now detaching themselves from our unworkable wreck on all levels: financial, legal, geographic, philosophical, cultural, and if they supported the system, it was not because they believed in it, but because granted them the freedom to opt out. The family juggernaut was hunkered down for the apocalypse in a residence like the set for a video game crawling with militarized undead, a scenario built for little white girls who come back to school from island vacations with beaded cornrows, maybe just 4. Nice locks. Yeah, we're thinking they might be hair curators. Back we go to a house full of good places to hide. Something from the before time? What about having someone who's always drinking soda, just like various local brands of soda, like Honecker's strawberry soda? Oh, word. So, not Coke? Feelin'. We were speaking in school, in the hall, in low tones. Me and my friends had a friendship like a conversation between marketers. A proper adult conversation was supposed to feel like sparkling water, but marketers' spitballing sparkled so hard there was no water left. But that's what we kind of liked, the way a living trilobite slowly turns into a demon of stone. So, the easy satire here would be to exaggerate existing traits, e.g., you have a person who drinks hyper-sweet, hyper-caffeinated soda, but we wish to instead go lateral and weird. That's kind of stoolin', I feel. Like many people now, I said I feel instead of I think. Class let out with a rustle, because we'd all started wearing nylon capes. We didn't understand them, but they were basically a shapeless coat, an easier coat, easier to fabricate, easier to don and doff. Hide your crappy self and send it aloft. They went well with the music we were listening to, those crowdsourced black box recorder mixes of hundreds of non-language sounds emitted by people at the moment of impact. Under my friend's cape, you'll find a vintage hoodie emblazoned with Propfitch Ath Dept 89, vintage Gap 1969 jeans, a baseball cap that said Polo LXVII, and a splash of Inez and Vinud's classic fragrance 1996. What's under my cape? I might handwrite a random phrase on my clothing. Violating a commercially produced garment was a signal far more antisocial than any tattoo. Societies had been known to outlaw it. I'd maybe cut holes in my clothes under the armpits, or up front by the side seam pants pockets. As with any sufficiently ugly sartorial gesture, cutting holes so people glimpse your skin places you in the realm of far-seeing couture and mental illness. Go ahead and slice up your shirt so your pits show. Scrawl Minal Wanjur on your pants in Sharpie and see how they stare on the subway. The young have always rediscovered abstraction, mutation, and psychedelia, because these represent the perverting force of forms in revolt. This is what lent the elusive and lucrative quality to, say, classic 2010s streetwear design, where someone on the street would be wearing a hoodie with an all-over print of skulls and crossbones, and you'd notice the skulls were actually SpongeBob wearing a Monopoly top hat. And it wasn't crossbones, it was a dildo and a mortgage contract. Idiotic and tired, but highly reproducible. In those days, the chief mandate was to make oneself into a maximally reproducible component. It was the young who wore 5 subcultures in one outfit and got away with it because they knew how to stack the codes, motherfucker. You learned it from them. And now they had to forge ahead into even more occult realms. And by the time you got around to wearing streamer cat ears and hoodies that said, "I hate my life," they were back on vintage Gap and defunct 2010s mall brands. The closest you got was high-tech outerwear, where you paid a premium to juxtapose rugged epaulettes with breathable performance liners. I quickly found my phone and posted, "Like people who think Helmut Lang pioneered special rinses, when point of fact, native son Ralph Lauren done it in the early 90s. Those antique industrial washers he stumbled on down south, the Carolinas or something, and he was just catching a ride on some slipshod denim folkway." After college, I bought a point-and-shoot and started taking pictures. In the hundreds of photographs I took around the turn of the century, New York City appears empty and lonely, but in fact it was me who was lonely and who wished to be empty, because the city felt overfull, and so did I, brimming with desire, fear, and confusion. My photographs captured some of the mess and off-to-the-sidedness that lay within and which I couldn't face. Within each of us lie unfulfilled urges that are never expressed because we lack the social means to do so. It is futile to seek the expression of these urges in our work or career, family or friends, love or sex, so we must turn to art for the feelings that exist nowhere else. Art shows us how to mix inside and outside, self and other, private and public, material and immaterial. Art reveals our non-human part. In high school, I discovered the literature of anxious surfaces and eagerly read my way through a neurotic, anti-psychological current that wells up in Kafka and courses through authors like J.G. Ballard, Patricia Highsmith, Graham Greene, and the Romans d'Ur of Georges Simenon. Here the eye is directed outward, away from the seething center, which we glimpse only in brief reflections. I learned that laughter and happiness were as generic and smooth as high-use public surfaces, as impersonal and indestructible as the partitions in an airport bathroom. A finger might leave a greasy smudge, but the experience was otherwise unrecorded. Joy, on the other hand, was different. Joy was a small, sharp puncture where the inside had attempted to emerge and then receded. Joy might poke through in a moment of melancholy or even terror. Joy was an ecstatic injury. When I was 3 years old, there was a kid on my block with a thick monobrow that shrouded him in inscrutability. I was impressed and began practicing my own frown. This looked insane and was promptly questioned and ridiculed, so I stopped. Next, I tried to purge all expression from my face. Looking back, I recognize in this the severity and impassivity of religious iconography, from pre-Columbian tablets to Catholic decor. In ritualistic art forms like Yupik masks and Mayan carvings, the grin of the spirits and the animals is not happy or friendly. It is simply another way to bare teeth. But even if it lacks laughter, the smile of the spirits is a kind of ecstatic injury. In kindergarten, Raymond Vega and I were sitting on beige plastic chairs, him on my right with his hands on his knees, when suddenly his left arm opened mechanically and landed a fist in my gut. I always filed this under unprovoked cruelty. Recently, however, I realized that I must have insulted him, and my understated delivery made it sting, and my distanced curiosity, the provocation as experiment, made it cruel. We didn't talk about the incident, and were friendly afterward. Raymond was big and sweet and dense. By 6th grade, he had a trademark shabby mustache, which I envision even when I picture him in kindergarten. He was not the hairiest in the 6th grade, though, because no one had more preternatural manliness than Pedro. It was an achievement that deeply embarrassed him, and it's a testament to Pedro's good nature that he never weaponized his shame. If you declined to weaponize your shame, however, we were happy to turn it against you. A group of us hunted down a freakishly tall transfer student who had the nerve to be chipper, pinned him to the dry grass of the playground, ignoring his shrieks, and forced those long legs apart until he wept. Only then did we scatter, mumbling and shrugging. He never mentioned the incident. We all hung out like we always had. In that same playground, an older boy on a bike hoisted a plastic bag and decanted snack crumbs onto my scalp and mushed them around while I stood there helplessly. My mother had to wash and wash. I can still summon the cloying smell of processed peanut flavoring. In that same playground, a friend laughed when I committed some tiny failure, probably a bike trick that didn't come off. Enraged, I snatched the cap from his head, stuffed it deep into a municipal trash can, and pedaled away. My mother let me know that his mother was upset because that cap meant the world to him. I understood that his mom was a single white gay lady without much money, raising an adopted black kid who was often ridiculed. I knew that to retrieve the hat she would have had to plunge her hand through a heap of sickness. In that same playground, a group of teenagers taunted my sister and me, sending us racing home, and then my father ran out to confront them, seizing a dead branch from the ground, and I followed into the twilight and watched him wield the stick, and this was more frightening than whatever it was the teens had said. 2nd grade, I don't trust you, Seth. 3rd grade, Seth, you talk about things you don't know about. 6th grade, what's the matter, man? You're like dead. 7th grade, Seth, you're not weird, you're odd. High school, Karen made a spastic joke, noticed me sitting there expressionlessly, and combusted. What the fuck, Seth? You're so arrogant. I was informed that I was aloof, and I was. I cannot explain the impulse except like this. Do not reveal the secret. There must be quantities that cannot be measured. There must be feelings that cannot be expressed. There must be words that cannot be said. I want my expressions to be empty of me. I wish the art that I make to have nothing to do with me. The goal is to capture something beyond the human.
You've just listened to part 1 of Seth Price's essay, Machine Time. Audio editing, mixing, and sound design by myself, Lil Internet, for New Models. This reading is part of Heavy Traffic Magazine's residency at New Models, made possible by subscribers. To hear part 2 and the rest of the series, visit patreon.com/newmodels or newmodels.substack.com. Machine Time was originally published in Heavy Traffic Magazine Issue 1. Visit heavytrafficmagazine.com for more, or pick up the newly released Issue 4 at your favorite bookstore. Thanks for listening.